So mainstream media clause for Tulsi Gabbard came out because, let's be honest, she absolutely obliterated Kamala Harris in the debates. I mean, she was an attack dog, and it worked. So, they can't respond on the topic of the discussion, which is Kamala's record as a prosecutor. So instead, they go into Empire Strikes Back mode, and they smear nonstop. And there's a long video, but it's well worth every second. These are most of the post-debate interviews that Tulsi did. And in almost all of these discussions, maybe flat out all of them, they portrayed it to her like, oh, let's talk about your criticism of Kamala. Let's have that discussion on Kamala's record as a prosecutor. And then as soon as she agrees to do the interviews, is that the main focus of the interview? No. Oftentimes they just tag that on at the end of the conversation. But like anywhere from 60% to 80% of these respective interviews and conversations were focused on, take a guess, Syria and Assad. Watch.
This president has chosen to double down and triple down on an alliance with Saudi Arabia, a country that is the #1 propagator of the radical Wahhabi Salafist ideology that fuels terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda, a country that both directly and indirectly supports al-Qaeda in countries like Yemen and Syria. And secondly, this president is doubled down on support for al-Qaeda and continuing this regime change war in Syria, even threatening to use our own military to respond to anyone who tries to attack al-Qaeda in the city of Idlib in Syria, where they are in control of and have their stronghold. This is deeply concerning to all of us as Americans, but for me, especially as a soldier who enlisted after the attacks on 9/11 to go after al-Qaeda, that terrorist group that took thousands of lives on September 11th. This is a huge betrayal to all of us, to all of our service members, to all of those first responders on 9/11, to every family that lost a loved one on that day.
Congresswoman, do you not believe that the same could be said for your meeting with Bashar al-Assad?
I don't know how you could equate that. We're talking about a president that is directly...
That you would be meeting with the leader of Syria who could feasibly be responsible for the killings of over 500,000 people, who ordered the chemical attacks on children in his own country?
I will never apologize for doing all that I can to prevent more of my brothers and sisters in uniform from being sent into harm's way to fight another regime change war, the likes of which we have seen in Iraq and Libya and Syria, that have taken so many of our service members' lives, that has taken so many of our taxpayer dollars out of the pockets of people in this country, people who are suffering, people in places like Detroit, like Flint, Michigan, communities across this country, what to speak of the suffering that's been caused. So if that means meeting with a dictator, meeting with an adversary in order to accomplish that mission of keeping the American people safe, making sure our troops are not continuing to be sent on these wasteful wars, putting their lives at risk, and making sure we've got the resources for the American people, I'll do what is necessary. And frankly, that's the kind of commander-in-chief we need, that truly has the courage, just as we've seen in our country's past, how, President Kennedy met with Khrushchev, how Roosevelt not only met with Stalin, a murderous dictator who killed millions of people. Let me finish. Who met not only with Stalin, who killed millions of people, but actually allied with him. Why? Because it was in the best interest of our country and the American people, and to bring about an end to that war. So no, if it means meeting with dictators, if it means working with people who do things that we find abhorrent.
Or meeting with Bashar al-Assad, but not necessarily meeting with the leader of Saudi Arabia, or supporting, or having a relationship with them.
Sure, you're mixing two different things up. I'm talking about having a meeting.
I don't think I'm mixing two different things up. I'm just trying to get clarity on it, because there seems to be some inconsistencies in your views of it.
There's no inconsistency whatsoever. Having a meeting for the pursuit of our national security and peace is one thing. I would meet with the leader of Saudi Arabia, with leaders of Iran, with leaders of North Korea in that pursuit of national security, keeping the American people safe. The difference between that and what Donald Trump has done and continues to do is he has cozied up, allied with, and supported Saudi Arabia in their support of al-Qaeda and in support of this genocidal war in Yemen that continues to this day.
Good to see you. So I want to talk to you about how you took and why you seemed obviously dissatisfied with the senator's answers last night, what you think the state of play is after last night for you and the other Democrats. But I want to clear something up. You need to acknowledge that Bashar al-Assad is a murderous despot, and you can still make your argument that the United States has no business risking blood and treasure in places where it should not be. I don't understand why you didn't give that answer last night.
Well, first of all, let's talk about what you're addressing here. And I don't dispute anything that you're saying there. He's a brutal dictator, just like Saddam Hussein, just like Gaddafi in Libya. The reason that I'm so outspoken on this issue of ending these wasteful regime change wars is because I have seen firsthand this high human cost of war and the impact that it has on my fellow brothers and sisters in uniform. You know, Chris, I respect you because you've spent a lot of time throughout your career shining a light on the challenges that veterans face when they come home. I will do anything and everything that I possibly can to stop sending our men and women in uniform into harm's way, fighting in these wasteful, counterproductive wars.
The notion deserves nothing but respect, Congresswoman. Deserves nothing but respect. I'm not disputing that. I think it's a legitimate claim. But here's what I'm asking.
Even if
you put yourself in a hole, though, Congresswoman.
Let me just finish. Let me
Go ahead. Finish your point,
Let me finish this point,
please.
because it's essential. It's central to the question that you're asking. I will never apologize to anyone for doing all that I can to prevent more of my brothers and sisters in uniform from being sent into harm's way to fight in these wasteful, counterproductive regime change wars, even if it means meeting with a brutal dictator focused on that objective, keeping the American people safe, making sure my brothers and sisters in uniform are honored by only being sent on missions that are worthy of their sacrifice, and making it so that we stop wasting trillions of our taxpayer dollars on more of these wasteful wars when they are so needed right here at home to address the essential and urgent needs of people in our communities, people like those here in Detroit.
I take issue with none of that. None of it. Do not make any other assumption about anything. I'm talking about one specific thing. All of that is completely valid and does not need any benefit to Bashar al-Assad. On your website, I don't understand why you have information on there that questions the notion that Assad is responsible for things that the U.S. intel and the United Nations intel believe he's responsible for. You don't need to defend him to make your argument. I don't understand why you do.
I've never defended Assad.
The stuff on the website questions the legitimacy of his connection to the attacks.
What you're referring to are cynicisms, a skepticism that I have expressed because I've served in a war that was caused by people who lied to us, who lied to the American people, who presented false evidence that members of Congress and U.S. senators believed and voted for a war that resulted in the loss of lives of over 4,000 of my brothers and sisters in uniform.
I asked Kamala Harris about that exchange. She certainly seemed, surprised that I think she was not expecting that from you. The only thing really she said about you is she said that you were essentially an apologist for Bashar al-Assad, that you would never criticize him as a dictator or murderer.
I think it's unfortunate and a disservice to voters in this country that she resorts to cheap smears rather than actually addressing her record, the issues that I've raised, and the fact that she said she is proud of this record. If that's the case, then voters deserve to hear about why she's so proud of the lives that she has negatively impacted, the families that she's torn apart in California.
If voters are wondering what is your take on Bashar al-Assad, what do you say?
My take is one of a soldier, where I've seen the cost of war firsthand. In Iraq, serving in a medical unit every single day, confronted with that high human cost of war. So I will never apologize for doing all that I can to prevent more of my brothers and sisters from being sent into harm's way to fight counterproductive regime change wars that make our country less safe, that take more lives, and that cost taxpayers trillions more dollars. So if that means meeting with a dictator or meeting with an adversary, absolutely, I would do it. This is about the national security of our country.
I understand that position. Do you consider him a torturer or a murderer?
That's not what this is about. I don't defend or apologize or have anything to do with what he has done to his own people.
But if you're president of the United States, it's fine if you want to meet with somebody, but there's traditionally a role of a president of the United States calling out human rights abuses overseas. Bashar al-Assad is head of a regime which has disappeared many people as his father.
Here's the way that I look at it, and the kind of leadership, the example of leadership that I follow is one where Kennedy met with and worked with Khrushchev to forge a deal that would keep the American people safe. Where obviously Reagan met with Gorbachev, Roosevelt met with Stalin, worked with Stalin. Nixon met with Mao. These are the kinds of leaders who think about things at a very practical and real level about how to keep our country and the American people safe.
Stalin murdered 20 million people.
That's my point, exactly.
Right.
Yet Roosevelt not only met with him, but he allied with him to bring about an end to that war.
But I'm sure Roosevelt would have acknowledged that Stalin murdered millions of people. You don't want to.
I don't dispute that. Again, my focus.
But you won't say anything about that about Bashar al-Assad.
I've been very outspoken about this before. These are things that are being used as detractions away from the central issue, which is we are still waging a regime change war in Syria today. We still have troops in Syria today, troops who are dying. That's my focus. That's why I'm running for president, to bring about this sea change in our
I understand
foreign policy.
I hadn't planned to go down this road, but I understand the not wanting to get involved militarily, and certainly as a veteran, you have more of a right than anybody to talk about that and have an opinion about it. Just on a factual basis, Bashar al-Assad is a murderer and a torturer. Do you not agree with that?
I don't dispute that.
You don't dispute that. Okay.
There's a reason why Chris Cuomo, Anderson Cooper, whoever that MSNBC host was, there's a reason why they're the ones who have shows on these networks. Because they're the ones who are going to be... Balloon! They can... Whatever they're distracted by, the shiny object, they'll chase that shiny object. Now, do yourself a favor. Go look at all the segments. They're endless, by the way, so you won't be able to do it. Look at all the segments criticizing Tulsi Gabbard on Syria, and then look at all the segments criticizing Kamala on her record as a prosecutor. There were roughly about 17,462 criticizing Tulsi on Syria, and probably less than 5, and that's being kind. It might be like 1 or 2 criticizing Kamala on her record as a prosecutor. The original conversation, the reason why Tulsi, for most of these interviews, the reason why she was invited on was, let's talk about your, what you said about Kamala and whether or not you think she gave a solid answer, and we can get into that. And then most of the respective interviews were talking about Syria. Now, I'm not saying it's some sort of coordinated mustache-twirling conspiracy behind the scenes where, like, all these mainstream media hosts get together and they say, we're going to defend Kamala, right? Yeah, we're going to defend Kamala and we're going to attack Tulsi. But again, that's why they were hired, because you don't need a formal backroom conspiracy. This is the groupthink that comes from these networks. The groupthink is, and Kamala even said it, I'm a top-tier candidate, and she's like, nobody. The groupthink is Kamala serious, Tulsi not serious. Kamala good, Tulsi bad. So even when the conversation is nominally supposed to be about Kamala's abysmal record as a prosecutor, they immediately go to, hey, I'm going to bring up this thing that you responded to about 17 quadrillion times and bring it up as if it's like serious, real, and you haven't spoken about it yet. So, let's go through some of this. The MSNBC host tried to say, you're a hypocrite because you're criticizing Trump for de facto supporting al-Qaeda through Saudi Arabia, yet you spoke to Bashar al-Assad. The problem isn't Trump talking to Saudi Arabia. In fact, everybody on the left is in favor of dialogue, in favor of talking to Saudi Arabia, in favor of talking to all these different countries. The problem is the material support of Saudi Arabia and then by extension, al-Qaeda. That's the problem. The problem is we're arming a vicious terrorist regime. That's the problem. The arming of them. Tulsi Gabbard wasn't going to meet Assad to hand him over, a fresh batch of anti-tank missiles. She was meeting because she was pursuing diplomacy and peace. Now you could say, hey, she's in Congress. I don't know why she did that. It was, it wasn't her role. Well, that's all fine and dandy. But am I offended? Am I mad No, I wish that somebody went in, 2002, right before we invaded Iraq and went after Saddam. I wish you had U.S. Congress people going over there for peace, to de-escalate. I wish we had that. I wish we had it with Gaddafi. So I'm not mad at her for wanting to avoid a war and regime change in a country where who would fill the vacuum if Assad's gone? Answer, jihadists, because 60% of the rebels, according to a study from 2 or 3 years back, are jihadists. So am I mad at her for going to talk to the head of a government? No, not at all. Not at all. Not even close. So what a red herring. What a terrible argument. Oh, aren't you a hypocrite because you spoke to Assad? Sure, Trump is arming and backing Al-Qaeda and a terrorist regime, but aren't you a hypocrite because you spoke to a world leader? No, not at all. I want Trump to speak to world leaders, just like I gave him credit for talking to Kim Jong-un. What I don't want is materially arming them and backing them and helping them carry out their atrocities like we're doing in Yemen right now. So what a terrible argument. And then the Chris Cuomo one was, hey, okay, I get it. So you're not in favor of war. However, why don't you just agree with the logic of the Pentagon and the CIA completely and then at the very end say, but I don't agree with war? So in other words, every little bit of the propaganda against the Assad government, agree with all of it, and then you could pull up short and say, but no war. Listen, I've seen this play before. The same thing happened in Iraq, where it got to the point where the strongest voices against the war in Iraq, they would have to say, oh yes, no, yes, don't get me wrong. Saddam Hussein is a monster. Saddam Hussein is a vicious dictator. Saddam Hussein massacred his own people with our support, but don't say that part. Saddam Hussein violated all these UN resolutions. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, but please don't go to war. So in other words, agree completely with the logic of war and then say, but I don't agree with the conclusion. Do you not see how that also helps build the case for war? Now, I'm not saying you can't say that which is true. You absolutely can. So, if she says, hey, according to some experts, they say Assad did the gas attack. Totally fine. I would have no problem with that whatsoever. However, what you never hear in mainstream media is, again, there's also evidence that the jihadist rebels used poison gas as well. And just so everybody knows, jihadist rebels, it's not like, you could take their word at everything they say and they're freedom fighters and they're just purely the good guy, but that's how it's all portrayed in U.S. media. The rebels are just freedom fighters who are trying to topple a dictator and set up a Jeffersonian democracy. Yes! That's the portrayal, but that is not true. That's the comic book version. That's the propaganda version. And what Chris Cuomo wants is Tulsi Gabbard to say, I agree with everything the Pentagon says and the CIA says, and they're pushing for regime change, but I agree with everything they say, but I'm not for intervention. Well, no. She's an independent thinker, and she's going to say, hey, I agree with this part. Notice, she admitted, she said, I think he's a brutal dictator. Boom, there you go. And she said it repeatedly. So, it's not like she's willing to say what she thinks is factually true, full stop. But they try to portray her as like, oh, you have this irrational love of this brutal dictator. This is the exact same thing that people said about so many politicians in 2003 in the lead up to the Iraq War. They said, oh my God, you love Saddam Hussein, this brutal dictator, and you're just, you're some sort of really evil, fanatical, crazy person because you're supporting this terrorist regime, this rogue dictator. How dare you? When in reality, the nature of all of those critics was, let's be independent-minded, let's be objective, let's be rational, and let's not rush to war. Let's not immediately believe everything we're told by intelligence agencies. And that's what Tulsi's doing in the case of Syria, and she's getting smeared relentlessly for it. And then, listen, here's the bottom line. That entire time in all those conversations, she was supposed to be talking about Kamala's record as a prosecutor. They barely touched on it at all. Very little. Now, in the clips, you didn't see them touch on it literally at all, but there were some parts later on where they did talk about it, but it was quick. It was in and out, done. And I'm going to leave you with the reality on that. Kamala Harris laughed at the idea of legalizing marijuana in 2014. 2014, that's not that long ago. 2014, man. her Republican opponent supported legalizing recreational marijuana, she laughed at it and scoffed at it and act like, oh, please. This like fairy tale idea is ridiculous. Kamala Harris, maybe the worst part of her record, in my opinion. She supported civil asset forfeiture. Civil asset forfeiture is legalized robbery by cop. They can just jack your property and your money and say, I think you were going to use it in a crime, so I could just take it and I flip the burden of proof and you have no recourse. She supported that. Why? Because Kamala Harris is a cop. So that's incredibly important to talk about these things. It's incredibly important to talk about the fact that there was a memo where her own staff told her you should go after Steve Mnuchin for what he did with One West Bank, foreclosing on, elderly people early against the law, and she decided, I'm not going to go after Steve Mnuchin, and she had also taken donations from Steve Mnuchin. I mean, the list goes on and on, man. The fighting to keep the wrongfully convicted behind bars, this is all stuff that she did. And none of the conversation was about that. Why? Because the media has their favorites, and their favorites are the safe establishment candidates who give nominal change, like, oh, wow, a black woman. We might have the first black female president. That's wonderful. They use the nominal change, the surface level change, but they like the status quo maintenance in terms of the politics. So that's Kamala Harris to a T. And that's their philosophy. Now, they don't realize they have a philosophy. They don't realize they have an ideology, but they do. The philosophy that permeates through these mainstream media networks it's a pro-establishment bias. It's a pro-centrism bias. It was just, you could have predicted it beforehand if you've been following politics for a long time, but you knew that as soon as Kamala Harris, on a national stage in front of millions of people, kneecapped their girl, Kamala, you knew that they were just going to go for Tulsi's throat, and you knew it was going to be vicious, and you knew it was going to be substanceless. I mean, listen, I have criticisms of Tulsi Gabbard. I've made them crystal clear. There's plenty of things about her where I cringe and I hate it, like the BDS vote. She agreed with the official condemnation of BDS. Inexcusable. The equivocating on torture. When the torture report came out, she said she hadn't read it yet. I don't care. Either way, you don't equivocate on torture. Inexcusable. There's plenty of stuff that I say, whoa, those are legit criticisms of her. What you just heard right there is not at all a legitimate criticism. What you just heard right there is an attempt to smear a candidate and take her down because she was successful in exposing one of their beloved candidates.